And joining us now to discuss everything connected to this ceasefire as it currently stands and the negotiations coming up this weekend is Courtney Freer. She is an assistant professor at Emory University, an assistant professor specializing, we should point out, in Gulf politics and international relations. Professor, thanks for your time. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start here. What is, in your view, the state of this ceasefire between the United States and Iran? Is it sturdy or is it a little tenuous right now?
I'd say it's quite tenuous right now. I think one of the big issues is, what are the conditions of the ceasefire, and do both of the parties who are taking part in the ceasefire, do they agree on what those conditions are? On the Iranian side, they believe that a ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran should also include a ceasefire in Lebanon. And so for them, the continued violence in Lebanon is enough to break the ceasefire. And so we have other issues on which there's a disconnect. For instance, who controls the Strait of Hormuz? Is that controlled solely by Iran? Iran has said that they will control access to the strait and will take money for that. President Trump has opined that potentially the U.S. could do this through a joint venture with Iran. So again, another disconnect. And also there's the remaining issue of uranium enrichment in the nuclear program in Iran as well. So a lot of questions still. I think we have a starting point for negotiations for sure, but I think we're far from a permanent solution, at least at this point.
Items that negotiators, you would think, would have to hammer out at these weekend talks, or at least begin to hammer them out at these weekend talks taking place in Islamabad, in Pakistan this weekend. Professor, you laid out a lot of these elements. Let's kind of walk through them one by one. The Strait of Hormuz is a place in the world that if folks were not aware of it before this war, they certainly are now, as a critical choke point in the global supply chain of oil. In normal times, about 20% of the world's global oil supply moves through this critical, very narrow portion of water, about 20 miles wide at its most narrow point. That's been cut off. Reopening the strait was a condition of the ceasefire, at least as President Donald Trump described it. Are the Iranians and the president on the same page about what the status of the strait is right now? Is it open? Is it closed? Is it somewhere in the middle?
It seems that it's somewhere in the middle, maybe closer to closed than to open. It again, I mean, like a lot of things, it depends whom you ask and at what time you're asking. It seems that there are conditions for entry through the strait, and a lot of neighboring Gulf states, as well as the United States, are not happy with this. They believe that this should not be conditionally accessed, especially given how much of the world's energy passes through the Strait of Hormuz. And so we have this disconnect in terms of A, who controls it. B, how is it controlled in terms of is this controlled through money? Is access granted through a payment? And then C, who gets that payment? So I think these are kind of the main issues. And even beyond that, I think it's worth pointing out that even if the strait is opened up completely, we're still likely to see a shortage when it comes to global oil supply simply because of the damage that has been done to a lot of the oil infrastructure in the Gulf.
What role does Israel play in all of this? This ceasefire is between the United States and Iran. Where does Israel factor into all of this?
So, I mean, so Israel has also been involved in the attacks on Iran and has been hit by Iranian attacks as well, and so is a part of this, um, generally speaking. Iran has looped into its conditions. It's released these 10 terms for ceasefire, and one of these is a complete ceasefire in Lebanon, and this would include any Israeli violations of that ceasefire. So, any Israeli attacks on Lebanon would be considered by the Iranian regime as a violation of the broader ceasefire with the United States. And so for Israel, it's obviously a major security concern that you have still this Iranian regime in place, which is still capable, it seems, of launching attacks, at least to some extent. And so it will be interesting to see whether the conditions of ceasefire that Iran has laid out for with the United States, I mean, if those line up with what Israel wants as well, given that Israel is much closer geographically, of course, to Iran.
And those strikes in Lebanon, Israel has said, are targeted at Hezbollah, which is an Iran-backed militant group that's based in Lebanon, and in particular in Beirut, in the southern portion of the city of Beirut, as well as elsewhere. How much control does the current Iranian regime have of some of its proxies now that the leadership structure of Iran has been so dramatically changed after many of their top leaders were killed in the opening salvo of U.S. and Israeli strikes at the beginning of this war?
That's a great question, and it's one that's really difficult to answer. So I would say I think that the operations last year that Israel conducted against Hezbollah did definitely weaken the group. There is new leadership of Hezbollah at this moment as well. In terms of the connection with Iran, we're hearing different things from different people in terms of the extent to which these proxies kind of work alongside the Iranian government. I will say that Hezbollah did say initially that if the ceasefire did extend to Lebanon, that it would respect the ceasefire. Of course, we know that that has no longer happened. And so there is alignment, at least on that one issue. Does that mean that there's alignment more broadly? We don't really know. I presume that the communication links are open, at least to some extent. But it's really difficult to track kind of how closely the proxies are still aligned with Iran. Also, are they still receiving funding from Iran, which would be one major reason to maintain that connection.
I think another question many people have is all of a sudden Pakistan is playing a pretty integral role as a mediator between the United States and Iran. How did Pakistan emerge as this essential component to the negotiations?
I will say that for what it's worth, I was surprised as well that Pakistan was leading these negotiations. I mean, in the past, the previous talks, Iranian nuclear talks between the U.S. and Iran earlier this year, were mediated by Oman, and the Gulf states have often played this mediating role. That said, given that they've been targeted in this war, they're not mediating at this point. You need a party which is seen as neutral and also capable of organizing all of these different groups together. And so Pakistan, given that it maintains ties with all parties involved, seems to be this kind of neutral party that can help to mediate what's happening. And so it's our hope that this will work, that if you have a mediator whom both parties trust to have their best interests at heart, that then this can move things along.
How difficult will it be for both of these parties, Iran and the United States, and we should factor in Israel here as well, because they're going to play a role in one way or another in whatever the final outcome of this situation is. How difficult will it be to get everybody on the same side and reach an agreement that all sides can walk away from and cease these military operations? It seems like a tall order with all these different factors you've laid out.
It's certainly a tall order. It's not impossible. I will say at least we do have a starting point in terms of there are these 10 conditions or 10 terms that the Iranians have laid out. There are 15 conditions that the US government has put together as of the end of March. These haven't been released, but we can guess that some of the major issues for the US and Israel will be, of course, opening the Strait of Hormuz, the positioning of Iranian proxies. What will happen to Iranian proxy groups? Will they be dissolved? That's one issue that we're really not sure about. The nuclear enrichment program is another one which I mentioned. And again, the U.S. Iran talks stalled on this back in February, and this led to the position we're in today. Another issue is about the missiles program, which Iran has. And so, what will it be allowed to maintain what is left of that missiles program, which again, we don't know how severely that's been damaged. And another, I guess, two more issues, sorry to overwhelm, would be about what would happen to U.S. forces in the region. Iran has talked about the withdrawal of U.S. combat forces in the region, but what does that mean for U.S. bases that are not necessarily solely housing combat forces? And then the last issue is about sanctions relief and relief from tariffs as well. It seems that the U.S. is willing to move on that issue, but the other ones, I think, are much more difficult to come to an agreement on. Not to say that resolving the sanctions issue is by any means easy, but it seems that this is one in which we've seen some willingness to budge. But some of the other ones, I think, will be much more difficult to come to an agreement with which all parties feel safe and secure.
Let's talk about Europe for a moment here as well. The president and others in his administration have been critical of U.S. allies in Europe and NATO allies, we should point out. Where does Europe stand or factor in to these negotiations that are set to take place this weekend in Pakistan?
Yeah, great question. So one thing that's interesting is that what we've seen from Europe is, at least from France and from the UK, is we've seen a willingness to link the ceasefire in Iran with a ceasefire in Lebanon. So there is this desire to see a holistic ceasefire throughout the region rather than in just one theater of the war. That said, I mean, they're not really as involved in the mediation, certainly as some other parties. President Trump has, of course, been very critical of Europe for not doing things like allowing basing rights and things like this during the over the course of this war. So I think they're definitely a secondary party, but one that is still definitely interested in the cessation of the violence.
Professor, I want to ask you one last question here that's been floating out in international relations spaces and elsewhere. At the end of the day, whenever this conflict does end, does what remains of the Iranian leadership, are they going to be more or less motivated to try to move towards developing a nuclear weapon? They don't have a nuclear weapon. They didn't have one at the start of this conflict, and they have been on the receiving end of multiple strikes over the last year or so. There are other rogue governments out there. There are other, some would say, bad actors in the global neighborhood. Look at North Korea, that is not on the receiving end of strikes like this, and many would say it's because they have the nuclear deterrent. Is there a way to get past this, get through the conclusion of the conflict, and for the United States and our allies guarantee that the Iranian leadership that remains doesn't begin to race once again towards nuclear breakout?
That is the hope, certainly. The hope is that some type of compromise could be reached, I presume having to do with the allowing more of the missile system to remain and then pulling back on the nuclear enrichment side. I think a lot of it depends on A, how much damage has been done to existing military installments within Iran. We don't really know that. And then B, how strong the regime is. I mean, will the regime, after all is said and done, continue to face the type of resistance that we saw before the war started? And I think one other issue that emerges is if Iran is allowed to collect tariffs for the entry through the Strait of Hormuz, could that potentially help to fund a nuclear program, for instance? So I'm sure that all negotiating parties will want to make sure that there is no way that this kind of funding could be funneled into that type of program. How do you ensure that? I presume through weapons inspections through the IAEA, which is the UN's nuclear watchdog. But will Iran allow that? It's difficult to see. So I think there will have to be some type of compromise. The Iranian regime so far, however, has not been kind of has not sounded like it's willing to compromise, especially on this point. The foreign minister just yesterday made a statement about how, nuclear proliferation was its sovereign right. And so if you have that type of position, it's much more difficult to rein that in, especially if there is funding available and if the military installations haven't been as damaged as maybe we think they have been. So it seems so far that they're defiant in terms of wanting to maintain this nuclear program. But again, we'll see, I guess, what happens this weekend in Islamabad.
Yes, we will. And I know that you will be paying close attention, as will many people all around the world, to how these negotiations begin to take shape in Pakistan this weekend. Professor Courtney Freer with Emory University. Professor, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.